Hi, Doug here. I wanted to give you a little insight into how I am scanning my father's archive of 4x5 negatives. He was active from the 30s up until when he died in 20,000 and something, 2009 I believe it was. And he was an amateur photographer all the time, but he was in the Navy as a young man in his early 20s, stationed at the New Orleans Naval Air Station. He was head of the photo lab there. So he has a lot of material from that era of New Orleans in the early 1940s. And then he moved to Chambersburg, continued doing a lot of 4x5 work with the speed graphic camera. And I have this big archive of his negatives that I'm scanning so I can see what's there. The archive looks like this. The archive is these boxes I have on a shelf holding many 4x5 negatives. You can see he's got some of his greatest hits he scanned himself, and which I've made a little book out of. I'll put the link to that archive there. But this is the task before me, is how to convert many of these unseen pictures, which contain quite a bit of family legacy, into something that we can all see. So my first task is to make a setup where I can photograph these negatives. So I'm using my camera, a Canon 5D Mark III. It's one of my rigs that I've used for years. And then I bought this light box online that's color corrected, a nice LED box. It's got a switch under here to turn it on. So I've got that going, and that's where I put the negatives on. Then I've got a computer set up to record all this stuff that I do all my shooting on it, and a hard drive where it all gets backed up, plugged to a dock where everything's plugged into. So the first task is to level everything out to make sure this station and this lens are exactly parallel to each other. For a while I was using a little spirit level. I didn't find that all that accurate. I was using an iPhone for a while, a level on it. But what tripped me up was this little lens that sticks out, so you've got to be really careful. You don't have that on the surface you're trying to level. So you've got to be careful of that. So let's find my level app. And the great thing about this level, no, I don't want to rate you, is there. I got the level for this direction, and I can see that it's 0.3 degrees a little off plumb. What I can do is make sure this is exactly 0.3 degrees off plumb. And I have a really kind of cobbled together setup here with my old panoramic rig and a head from a big tripod, so I can very precisely orient everything in these two dimensions. So I just get this down there to be at 0.3 degrees that way. That matches that, 0.3. Then I look at this direction, making sure the camera lens is hanging off the lip, and I'm 0.2 on that axis. I can go up here, lay this camera on here, and go 0.2 degrees that way. So I don't have to have it absolutely level, I just have to have them parallel. And this bubble level makes that easy to do by exact degrees. So the next thing we do is clean our glass. Now this glass is actually from a specialized scanning rig I bought for my flatbed scanner. I thought I would do these negatives on that at one point with my flatbed scanner. And so I bought this rig that lays on it the other way around. It's got a sheet of glass the size of the scanner, and then a smaller piece of anti-Newton ring glass, which is pretty important. If you put two pieces of glass together, you'll get a diffraction pattern that shows up. Anti-Newton ring glass is very lightly ground so that you don't get the diffraction pattern. So that's a little key piece of this rig I've got. I use rubbing alcohol as my glass cleaner, and keep that and wipe it down. And what I've done on the surface of the glass is I put a couple of strips of tape that act as the edge for where I'm going to put my negative when I lay it down. And that way I can put the negative in the same place every time. And so it lines up. I can fill the frame with this rig. The camera setup is, I've got a 55mm macro lens on there. It's quite a sharp lens, and so meant for close work. And so I've rigged the tripod to get it at the right height, and then with this whole array I can raise or lower it and get everything to the right height. It's a messy system, but it works. I once had a tripod set up where I had the camera in between the legs hung upside down, but I was reaching so far it was really hurting my back to do all these negatives. So this is a more ergonomic setup where I can sit down and do everything right here. So that's kind of why I have this set up this way. So glass is clean. Let's get started. I'm going to turn off the overhead light. First I'll turn the rig on. And then turn off the overhead because I get a reflection of the overhead light in the glass and it shows up on the images. That's no good. So I don't want that. Now, then I find a negative in the box here. I am now working on box 3 of the archive, of his personal archive. There's 7 of these boxes and a bunch more miscellaneous notebooks too. So we start at the very beginning. Let's find, here we go. I have this lifted up. I got a place for it to set where it won't scratch the glass. I use my hands because I hold them by the edges. It's too hard to use them as a, with gloves. It would make things hard. I have the notch where it is on this way. By film always had a notch here, the shiny side up. That's an easy way to tell it. I just slip it in, lean it against the tape, bring it down. I was using a negative mask to get rid of this white light for a while. Then I realized it's making no difference at all, and it was really slowing down my process, so I got rid of that. Then I go to the computer here. I have this tethered to the Canon manual shooting from the computer thing, so I can fire everything from here, and it sees everything here. So there's my setup. Things are a little cattywampus, I see. If I look on screen here, I need to move everything. Everything is shifted here. So, since now I'm probably going to have to go back and reset up my leveling now. But I want to get things so that everything is nice and parallel with those lines, so that when I process these later, it's really easy to do that. So we'll recheck the levels and all that stuff. But here is the live view I have of my image. I can enlarge it and then check the focus. Let's move this over a little bit. Can I do that here? Yes, I can. Yes, look at that. And I make sure it's in focus. And I figured out what the right exposure is for these, which is about, for a negative of this thickness, about 1/25 at f10. And I just fire away. There it shows up. Pull that out onto the next one. So I can get through a couple hundred negatives a day, no problem. And they just get stored on the backup drive right there. And I just work my way through them. So this is what the production line looks like. Of sometimes these negatives that aren't flat can be a little challenging to get in, but there you go. And I can just pop through a whole lot of these fairly quickly. So I just tap it against the edge of my tape there. Snap. Check to see that it looks decent on the screen, or decent enough. Nothing bad happened. And onward. This is so much faster than scanning. The file size is decent. It's like, you know, over 4,000 pixels wide, so that's a juicy file out of this thing. The scanner can do much bigger. It's more like 15,000 pixels wide, but I actually looked, I matched a pair that I scanned and then I shot this way, and this is actually higher quality. I have got better separations in the highlights. Well, they'll get a little chalky on the scanner. So in a way, this is the highest quality scan I can make, is doing it this way. So my father did an amazing body of work when he was a young man, before he was married. When he was in the Navy and having the time of his life, and you could just tell from the pictures that he was. And as the responsibilities of feeding a family of 4 and running a company and managing that, you know, you can see that his attention toward photography diminished to where he really was just a hobbyist documenting family events, and not really, it wasn't the center of his life like it was when he was 20 years old. You know, this is, you know, almost 20 years on, I'm looking at these pictures right now, and he would photograph some weddings for friends. I see people I don't know that there's wedding pictures of in these. There's everybody's birthday cakes. There's the family gatherings when they happen. And it's going to get really interesting to watch how this work changes in the next decade. I'm up to 1962 right now. To see what my family drama, how it plays out in these pictures. Because this is when my mother was getting more ill. She was hospitalized many times from mental illness. And so the family, and you can see the stress in my father was just intense during those years. Even as a kid, I could see that. But he did a good enough job holding the family together and making sure that all of us had our interests and our hobbies and our worlds we could lose ourselves into. In a way, he made sure we had worlds we could escape into. Because the family was not a lot of fun and not very supportive, but he gave unstinting support to whatever our interests were and whatever we wanted to do. And so that was his way of coping, and I'm sure that's the way he coped to his stresses in his life, and he passed it on to his family, and it wasn't the worst thing by any stretch. It really gave us a lot of capacity for self-motivation, and may have deprived us of intimacy, but you know, we can heal from that as an adults, and I managed a good job of that. But that's becoming the meaning of looking at this family archive for me, is looking over the legacy of my family on who I am today, and imagining who my father was. The side of him I didn't know, because you don't as children. You don't know who they are. And this is an insight into his life that I'm really getting from documenting his archive and trying to make connections between what he saw, what he chose to publicly display to the world, and what might have been going on in the interior life of the family at that time. That may be a bit much to read into this stuff. I'm sure he didn't read any of that into his work, you know, but that's the sense I'm making of it, as a self-involved, introspective boomer. Okay, here we are in Adobe Bridge. It's part of the Photoshop suite, is where I do all my editing. And here are some scans. If you notice, they all look like negatives. And so we have to change that if we don't want to know what's in there. So I'm going to open up everything, select everything, and open it up in Camera Raw, which is how I shot these things, all in Camera Raw. And the way I'm going to convert this from a negative into a positive is I'm going to use the curves field. I'm going to take the white point and bring it all the way to black. I'm going to take the black point and bring it all the way to white. I have inverted the curve, and so everything is now a positive. The rest are still negatives, but I can select all of those, and I can do a synchronize settings, which will make all the subsequent images the same settings as this one. Now I can go back individually and make adjustments to make this a prettier print. This was an overexposed negative, but I can change that. Now the peculiar thing with the inverted curves is that all my sliders now work backwards and in opposite directions than how they used to. It used to be I would drag my exposure slider to the left to lower the exposure, but it does the opposite now. So I got to go to the right to lower the exposure. Down at the bottom here, the blacks level control my whites. I have to lower it to bring up the whites. The whites I have to increase to bring down the blacks. So this is how I change my contrast, is these two sliders down here, whites and blacks. The shadows and highlights do similar things, but in different parts of the curve. I'll touch those if I need to do more precise adjusting of this. But that looks pretty good. I'll leave it at that. And I'll go through the rest of the file and make those similar adjustments all the way through. So I'll do group adjustments, individual adjustments, just do everything. The second thing I do is then I crop it down to the shape of the negative. So I go to the crop tool, and then I grab that, and that's about the size of my negative. I like showing the black edge. I double click, bang, we're there. I'm going to close this out and call it done. That's how we process our negatives. And poof, they all convert. Now, the second thing that's important with this information, especially if you're doing a photo archive that you want to have some legacy to, is you need to add information as to what the photograph is about. All I have to go on is what my dad wrote on the negative sleeves. That's the only information I have about these pictures. I have some information in my memory of who these people might be. I'm also the last person in my generation who's going to know that. So I don't want to record this. Now, I have a metadata template that I use for all this stuff. So I'm going to replace the metadata with the template I've made for the Ken archive. That's going to populate this everything with this information, you know. So the creator is Kenneth Plummer Sr. To contact Doug Plummer, I got my address in there. Now there's two important fields here. And these are the fields that will populate whatever caption information is in the social media you share it on. If you put it onto Facebook, the description headline is what it's going to look for. So I can say, you know, grandfather Scruggs with Carol Ann and Ken, Texas. And now we have some information that will attach itself to this file forever. And I will sit here with the stack of negatives, write down what's on each negative sleeve, and put it in the description field. So that's how you preserve the information of these images for future generations. Granted, the silver in the negatives is going to last longer than the magnetic fields on disk. So, in fact, we are in a way converting this to a more fugitive medium, and it depends on whoever gets this archive to upgrade it to whatever the storage standard is of the moment, of the time. But I'm doing the best I can to make this work more accessible. As a negative, it's inaccessible in terms of the information. I'm doing a process to make it more accessible and to be able to spread and share it. So we do what we can to hold back the forces of entropy. And this is my little part in doing that. That's how we convert negatives to scans.